In our lab so far, we've been using one account, administrator@vsphere.local, to log in and do all the work. However, in a production environment, it's very likely we're going to want to have individual user accounts for the purpose of tracking and accounting. Also, for the benefit of assigning different users various permissions. For example, we could have accounts for the help desk with read-only attributes, while administrators could have full access. And instead of recreating all the user accounts, what we could do is leverage existing resources, such as Active Directory. If we already have Active Directory up and installed, and we have our users and groups all set up in Active Directory, why not leverage those? Now, if vCenter was actually running on our Windows server, which it isn't, we have it running as the vCenter server appliance, but if it was running right here, the integration with Active Directory would be very easy to do. For an identity source, we just specify the local operating system where vCenter is running, and then it can go ahead and leverage those user accounts and groups already. However, in our case, because the vCenter server appliance is over here running as a VM, what we could do is we could still leverage Active Directory users and groups, and we could access them via LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. Or if we weren't using Active Directory and we had some other type of resource, maybe an open LDAP resource, we have options of pointing to that as well as an identity source that vCenter can use for the authentication of users. So it's a two-step process. Number one, we have to train vCenter on where the identity sources are and how it can get access to them. And then secondly, once it identifies those users and groups, we also need to specify at some level what permissions those users and groups have inside of vCenter. So in this lab, here's what we're going to do. We'll set up an identity source, we'll leverage our existing Active Directory, and we'll access that information via LDAP. And then just to verify that we can log in with an Active Directory user account and actually do something, we'll also, just for the purpose of demonstration, give an Active Directory user or group some privileges inside of vCenter so that once they do log in, they can actually do something. And then in a separate nugget, we'll focus on access control and the details of how permissions and users are linked together regarding various objects in the vCenter hierarchy. So for now, let's go to the hands-on lab. We'll set up an identity source and verify that it works. So for this first part, we'll log in as our traditional user, administrator@vsphere.local, and we'll supply our lab password for that King Kong account and click Login. Logged into the vSphere web client is showing us right here who we're logged in as. And as a courtesy, the vSphere web client is putting us back in the same location we were when we left it. So when we left it, we were looking at VM3 on the summary tab. And that's why we're back at the same location. And it tracks that for individual users. So what we want to do is we want to set up an additional identity source for single sign-on. So to do that, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and up here to the home icon and click on Home. In the navigator panel here, we have an option for administration. So we'll click on administration. And then here, under administration, we have access control and single sign-on. And that's what we want to focus on, single sign-on. We're going to click on configuration beneath single sign-on. So with configuration selected, if we click on the Identity Sources tab right here, we currently have two identity sources. We have vsphere.local, which we've been using with the administrator account, and we also have the local OS. In our case, that's the vCenter server appliance running the Photon OS. And if we want to add an additional identity source, specifically our LDAP services running off of our Active Directory domain controller, what we could do is simply click on the plus symbol right here to add an additional identity source. So let's do that. We'll click on the plus symbol to add an identity source. Then we have four options. We have Active Directory Integrated Windows Authentication using a client integration plugin. We have Active Directory as an LDAP server, which is the option that we're going to choose here in a moment. If we had a generic LDAP server, we'd choose the Open LDAP. And if we chose Local OS for the local operating system, that would use the local operating system that the vCenter is currently running on, which in our case is the vCenter server appliance. So we'll click on the second radio button for Active Directory as an LDAP server, and with that second button selected, we'll click on Next. Now it's asking for a name, and let's name this Windows Server with AD and LDAP. So for the base DN, distinguished name for users, we're going to use CN equals users, comma, DC equals NuggetLab, comma, DC equals com. And the CN represents common name, and DC represents domain component. So this is the location inside of LDAP where it can go ahead and do queries looking for users. And because I have users and groups in the same exact location, I'm going to copy that with a Control-C and paste that information again for the base distinguished name for groups. Next, it wants the domain name, and our domain is nuggetlab.com. So we'll put that in there. And then for the domain alias, that's going to be our NetBIOS name, which is NuggetLab. Our next challenge is this. This Windows server that's running LDAP isn't just going to let anybody ask for information about users and groups. So we have to provide a username that has access rights on that LDAP server to make those requests. And we may have in a production environment a separate account that we've set up on the Windows server to do that. However, in our lab environment, let's just specify the administrator account on the Windows server, which is administrator@nuggetlab.com, and then we'll supply the password for that administrator account. And then for the lab, I'm going to click on this second radio button to connect to a specific domain controller. Now we only have one, but if we do a DNS resolution for nuggetlab.com, I have several IP addresses on our domain controller. And I don't want to leave it up to the vCenter Server appliance to unfortunately pick the wrong one and not have connectivity. So for the primary server URL, we're going to go ahead and spell it out as LDAP :// and then the IP address that's reachable of our Windows server, which is 192.168.1.100. So then we can go ahead and click Next, review our information, and if it's all correct, we can click on Finish. Now before we click on Finish, let me take my browser out of full screen mode. And here's what I'd like to do. Let's launch Wireshark. It's a protocol analyzer. It's represented by this little fin, the shark fin, in the taskbar. So let's click on that once. And I've currently got three interfaces on this Windows server. I've got a storage interface because we're acting as an NFS and an iSCSI target. We've got the management network, and I've also got a connection to the VM network. Because this Windows server is also acting as a DHCP server, DNS server, and a default gateway for our VMs that get assigned to the network 10.3.3. So what I want to capture here is let's capture traffic on the management network. So we'll double click on management 1 to start that capture, and let's put in a display filter by typing in LDAP and pressing enter right here. So it'll only display in the output LDAP related packets. So with that in place, let's go ahead back to our Chrome browser by clicking on the Chrome icon in the taskbar, and let's click on Finish. So there it is, and if we click on the Wireshark icon again and click on Stop to stop the capture, this is the IP address of the vCenter Server appliance making a request over to .100, supplying those credentials for the lookup. And we have some success messages coming back. So that part looks great. So I'm going to go ahead and close Wireshark. I just wanted to make sure, I'll say quit without saving. I just wanted to make sure that our Windows server was responding. Another way we can verify that it's working is we can go over here under Single Sign-On in the vSphere Web Client under Administration, and we can click on Users and Groups. And from here, we can go ahead and use the drop-down for the domain, specify nuggetlab.com, and make sure that our user accounts from nuggetlab.com show up. So there's our administrator account from nuggetlab.com. And if we wanted to go through the additional step of creating an additional user and then coming back here and making sure it shows up, that'd be another way to verify that there's correct LDAP interaction between the vCenter Server appliance and the LDAP services that are running on our Windows server. So now, if administrator@nuggetlab.com wanted to authenticate, for example, connecting via the vSphere Web Client, the authentication would go great. However, vCenter and vSphere would say, what the heck? We've just authenticated this administrator at nuggetlab.com, but that user has no permissions whatsoever with vCenter. So sorry, that's as far as you go. So just to demonstrate a full login that's actually successful, let's take a moment and look under access control at global permissions. And we'll have a separate nugget on access control and permissions and roles. But for now, I just want to point out that there's this group. So under access control with global permissions selected, we have this group. There's a little icon of a group called vSphere.local/administrators. And this group has King Kong full access to everything in vSphere. So if we were to add, for example, the administrator at nuggetlab.com as a member of this group, or a group in Active Directory that's available via LDAP that our Nugget Lab administrator is a member of, and we made that a member of this group, we nested it inside, then when our administrator from nuggetlab.com logs in, he'll also have full access. And that way we can verify the login actually works. So to do that, under Single Sign-On, we'll go to Users and Groups. We'll click on Users and Groups. We'll click on the Groups tab here. And if you'll notice, here we have the Administrators group. So if we click on that Administrators group, it's showing us here that that group has one entity in it, which is the administrator user account at vSphere.local. That's a member of that group. So what we're going to do is simply click on the plus symbol right here regarding group members to add a member. And then we're going to choose from the domain called nuggetlab.com. And there's our administrator account, or if we want to go ahead and add the domain admins, we could do that as well. So if we scroll down this list, there's domain admins. We could also sort that a little bit by showing groups first. There's also a search field here, so if we typed in domain and pressed enter, that would filter to just show us the users or groups that had the word domain in them. So if we click on domain admins, for example, from Active Directory, and we're reading this via LDAP, and we clicked on add, our administrator account on the Windows server is a member of domain admins. So the concept is if we had a group called vSphere admins, we could add that group here to give that group authorization, and then in Active Directory we could just add or remove individuals from that group in Active Directory, and that would affect what rights those people had as they logged into vSphere. So for here, we'll use domain admins group, and we'll click on check names. It gives us a hunky door 2 thumbs up. We'll click OK, and then click OK again. So now what we have is we have the Windows Domain Admins group as a member of the vSphere Administrators group, which has all the permissions that we're going to need to do everything in vSphere. So to test this, we'll go ahead and click on our username up here, administrator@vsphere.local, and from the drop down, we'll click Log Out. And then we'll log in as our administrator at nuggetlab.com, hit the tab key, and we'll put in our lab password, and we'll click Login. So we're logged in as administrator at nuggetlab.com. We have the default layout, including the Getting Started tab. And if we want to unpin the recent objects and the recent tasks and the alarms and the work in progress, we can just use like we did previously. Just click on the little pin and that'll minimize that for us. So let's do that. I'm going to minimize all these items on the side. And I'm also going to click on the Help up here, and from the drop down, let's select Hide All Getting Started Pages. It'll give us a little bit more real estate. And then we can expand the USA folder and the data center and the clusters to see those details. And we have the VMs and Templates tab. We can go ahead and expand that as well to see the data center and the folders. And then we have the Storage tab. We can expand USA, expand the data center, expand the data store cluster, and then we have our networking tab as well. The other thing too is if you customize the screen and you want to just go back to square one, we can go up to our username. That brings up the drop down, and we have a reset to factory defaults, which will do it for us again, or we can click on layout settings. So if, for example, we closed and got rid of the recent tasks or alarms or recent objects, we could put the check in those checkboxes to bring them back, or we also have the option here to reset to the default layout. So if we click on that, it's going to go ahead and put back that default layout for us. And then if we go back to where we started, we'll click on Home, and from the drop down we go back to Administration, and under Single Sign-On we go to Configuration. This is where we started by clicking on the plus symbol and adding an identity source using an Active Directory LDAP server. And now, my friend, it is your opportunity to add an identity source using LDAP and then log in and verify that it works. So have some fun with the lab, and I'll see you in the next nugget. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.